held during Black History Month. And actually, that's really appropriate because the first immigration legislation was aimed at us. And I'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to give a little background. I think it's important to know the relationships between blacks and Indians. And make no mistake about it, when I'm talking about Mexican Americans, I'm talking about Indians. I'm not talking about Spanish, although I understand a lot of educated Mexican Americans would like to try to reach back into their Spanish roots. I want to give you some statistics to show you that that was few and far between. You speak Spanish, but you're Indian. I speak English, but I ain't British. So, the first history of Black and Indian relations probably goes back to the 25th dynasty from ancient Egypt, when they came across the Atlantic and entered a broad sea band between the Caribbean and Central America and parts of Mexico. They were toasted by their host, by the Olmec heads. Have anybody ever seen the 8-foot or 8-ton granite Olmec heads who were celebrating their African friends and visitors? There's no evidence that they clashed, but they meshed. There has been a transference of words in each of the languages. By the way, later Mexican historians, when they wanted to slide up under the Spanish, started to disown the Africanity of these heads. They were saying, they were actually writing in the history books, teaching to university students that these really weren't African heads, even though they had braids in the back of the statues, even though they were wearing helmets, the exact same as 25th dynasty in Egypt. They said, but they actually were jaguar faces. Or one person said that the reason the lips were so wide and thick and the nose was so broad is because there was an earthquake and the rock fell down and flattened out the features. So, and it must have been another earthquake to sit it back up straight. The next contact came principally from the West African country of Mali. This is documented in the works of Ivan van Sertima. They came before Columbus, and Harvard University professor Leo Wiener, Africa and the Discovery of America. About 100 years before Columbus, the Mandinka people, or the Mandingo people, came across the seas and they landed in an area around Tres Pontes, Mexico, present-day Belize, and all up and down that seaboard. Again, no information or indication of clash or war between the two people. When Columbus finally arrived looking for India or China and arrived in the seaboard, he was told by these Indian people, the indigenous people, that there were African sailors coming across the sea who arrived long before he did. And just a quick word about Columbus and his celebration, why it should not be a celebration. In his journal, which is recounted in Leo Wiener's 3-volume work, Africa and the Discovery of America, Columbus met the Indians who greeted him warmly, gave him gifts, treated him with respect. He went back and called his shipmates together and said, this is going to be easy pickings here. These people are so kind, so warm, it'd be easy to make slaves of them and steal all the gold. And these are words right out of his mouth. Somehow didn't make it into the American history books. And we can see why local Native American tribes, or nations as they call themselves, really object to Columbus. But moving on quickly, let's get into the Africans and the native Indian population in Mexico. Cortez, Hernan Cortez, was the first person who came with the Spanish conquistadores to conquer Mexico. He came from Cuba and brought a couple, only 2 Africans with him who were enslaved. Later, in his party and in subsequent parties, a lot of black people were part of the conquistadores. A lot of people don't know that there were a lot of black soldiers with the Spanish army. Now, they didn't come from Africa. They were native to Spain. Do they teach in Antioch that Spain was conquered and run for 700 years by the African Moors? True, that'd be true. And while they were in control of Spain, they allowed the Christians to maintain their own religion. They didn't enslave them. They allowed them to participate in the literate high culture that was available in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And that was the only light on the European peninsula at the time. Europe was steeped in the Dark Ages, and the only light on that, and I call Europe a peninsula because it's not a continent. Gibbs treated them with respect. He went back and called his shipmates together and said, this is going to be easy pickings here. These people are so kind, so warm, it'd be easy to make slaves of them and steal all the gold. And these are words right out of his mouth. Somehow didn't make it into the American history books. And we can see why local Native American tribes, or nations as they call themselves, really object to Columbus. But moving on quickly, let's get into the Africans and the native Indian population in Mexico. Cortez, Hernan Cortez, was the first person who came with the Spanish conquistadores to conquer Mexico. He came from Cuba and brought only two Africans with him who were enslaved. Later, in his party and in subsequent parties, a lot of black people were part of the conquistadores. A lot of people don't know that there were a lot of black soldiers with the Spanish army. Now, they didn't come from Africa. They were native to Spain. Do they teach in Antioch that Spain was conquered and run for 700 years by the African Moors? True, that'd be true. And while they were in control of Spain, they allowed the Christians to maintain their own religion. They didn't enslave them. They allowed them to participate in the literate high culture that was available in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And that was the only light on the European peninsula at the time. Europe was steeped in the Dark Ages, and the only light on that, and I call Europe a peninsula because it's not a continent, as we have been mistaught. It's just the far west frigid appendage of Asia. So, and by the way, when we look into history, you can never know the history of a people until you get rid of the labels that the conquerors have given them. People in Mexico did not call their country Mexico. It was Tenochtitlan. Now, there were a group of people called Mexicas, and I assume that the Spanish took that name when they applied it to the whole nation. But they did not call it Mexico. These were Indian people. The slave traders started to bring in Africans. It's estimated that it was far less than the American slave trade. Maybe 200,000 to 250,000 Africans were imported to Mexico to be enslaved. Problem was they didn't bring enough Spanish. So the Indians, typically throughout all of our history and our relationships with Indian people, aligned themselves with the Africans because the Spanish enslaved the Indians as well, but killed them off in higher numbers. And the Africans would just simply slip off and go to the Indian villages and live with them, or they started their own communities, variously called cimarrones or palenques or maroon communities. I wanted to give you some statistics as I'm trying to run right along. This is the university, take some notes. Spanish 1570 census. There were 6,644 Spanish Europeans in Mexico. There were 20,569 Africans, and there were 3.3 or 3.4 million Indians. There were 11,000 mixed Spanish and Indian. They became the buffer class. They became the ruling and controlling class to control the rest of their people. These are the people you would meet, who's a guy perhaps named Roberto Villa, who would say, "Hi, my name is Bob Villa. Trying to slide. We got some of them here today, do we not? Not in this room. But in any event, the Spanish had a strange classification. They had two classifications of mixed Africans and Indians. They had an Indian-African classification, 2,437 people. Then they had an African-Indian classification with 2,435 people. I don't know what the distinction is, so I merged them all together. In the 1646 census, there were 13,780 Europeans, 35,000 Africans, and the number of Indians had gone down from 3.3 million to 1.2 million. They were killing them off in those numbers. However, the African Indian population together, the merged population, had reached 225,000. So out of a population of 1.2 or 1.7 million people, 250,000 were African Indian mixture. By 1742, there were still only 9,814 Spaniards in Mexico. So those of you who are trying to trace your roots back to Spain, very remote. You're Indian people. There were 20,131 Africans at that time, and the Indian population was 1.5 million. However, there were 520,000 or so mixed African Indians in Mexico at that time. So African blood is running rich through all of our veins. And turn around and look at somebody and you might be looking at your cousin, whether you know it or not. Now, again, the Africans as well as the Indians objected to slavery. There were many uprisings, the biggest of which was the Yanga Revolt, Y-A-N-G-A, in 1570. In fact, there's a city in Veracruz, Mexico right now named after Yanga. There still are all African villages in Mexico today. They still speak Mandinka, and they have fraternal relations with their neighbors and what have you, but they hold fast to their tradition and their culture. I wanted to run right along to America, quickly to the Southwest, and go into a quick discussion about the Alamo. Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, Colonel Travis, and what have you. And everybody celebrates the Alamo and watch the movies, and we cry when the 100 men or so were killed by Santana. I say, long live Santana. Because these were some slave-holding racist bigots, not only in the Alamo, but throughout Texas. Mexico got rid of slavery in 1829 and refused to allow the Texans to institute slavery when they moved into Mexico. Mexico owned Texas at that point, at that time. So one of the chief bones of contention for the Europeans who were living in Mexico was that they be allowed to continue slavery. And Mexico said no. They said, well, at least allow us to chase the runaway slaves who come down into Mexico and bring them back here. Again, Mexico refused. Santana did even more than that. Not only did he defeat the people in the Alamo, but he freed a lot of slaves from the plantations in Texas. Ex-professor Ron Wilkins from Cal State Dominguez did the seminal work in this area and showed that 4,000 or 5,000 slaves went to Mexico permanently from Texas, never to return again. Another interesting migration into Texas were the Seminoles. Now, again,